Last week, heard a fabulous presentation here from Bo Jacobs, and it inspired me to totally revise some of what I wanted to talk about today and how to present. And what was the music that was on in the background, which was really hard to pick up, unfortunately, was from a singer, political activist, Charlie King, called Acceptable Risk. And it was a ballad about the real life story of atomic veterans, people who, young GIs, draftees, marched out into the desert at Yucca Flats in Nevada and were deliberately exposed to atomic bomb tests so that our government could decide and determine what the effects would be on battlefield preparedness for soldiers exposed to atomic weapons. Pretty horrifying thought, and really closely related to what Bo Jacobs was talking to in terms of the effects of radiation from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs and the continuing US government role. The draftees were told not to worry, and this is both a direct quote from what they were told and words of the song. The risks are all acceptable. Acceptable to who? And literally those atomic veterans, we were told to put their hands over their eyes. When the bomb went off, they could see the bones in their hands. And as the song Charlie King wrote, you could feel it in your bones. That time bomb started ticking. You can feel it in your bones. But the government said the risks were all acceptable. And the question for you as anthropology students, public health students, active citizens for the future, is to challenge when someone says the risks are acceptable. Ask, acceptable to who? Who decided these risks are acceptable? Who said it's safe? And your role in looking at, is it safe for whom? We're going to talk about how the US government, how our state government decides things are safe, but for what population are they safe? What is safe for me as an adult, 55-year-old male, is not what is safe for someone who is growing. What is safe for me as a 55-year-old male is not safe for a woman. We all respond to radiation exposure differently. And yet, as we'll be talking about today, we determine what is safe and tell people things are safe and tell them that they can use, whether it's the Columbia River at Hanford or a park in northeast Seattle, based on what is safe for me, the adult white male 55, and not what is safe for a child or a woman, because we set our standards based on something called reference man, indeed man. And one of the important things that I hope you take away today is the role that anthropologists and public health advocates have a responsibility for, which is saying what is culturally appropriate and how can you make a difference in working with communities to make sure their voices are heard. Hanford. How many people have been in the vicinity of Hanford in this room? About a third of you. That's more than last year's class.
I was born in Pasco.
Born in Pasco. You're a downwinder. The downwinders are the people our US government decided to expose to radiation deliberately. We wanted to know, as we were making plutonium for America's nuclear weapons after World War II and into the 1950s, how could we track the Soviets making nuclear weapons? We were flying over the Soviet Union and taking readings of radiation to try to track their development of the nuclear weapons. And so the US government decided that it was safe and acceptable to release vast quantities of radioactivity over eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, all the way to Montana, and track the plumes and see where it landed, and without telling people what they were exposed to, take readings. And only in 1986 did this become public, 30 plus years later. So Hanford is the most contaminated area in the Western Hemisphere. The only places more contaminated than Hanford are, just call out
Chernobyl,
Fukushima. Any students, any other thoughts about places more contaminated than Hanford? Well, the only other places are in the former Soviet Union where they made their nuclear bombs, because they even took less precaution than we did. And until Chernobyl, the most contaminated places in the world were the places where you're missing one really important one. Come on, I know a student can name something more contaminated than where we made nuclear bombs.
Now.
Nope. Good guess. Where we tested the bombs. Right. And then we told people it's safe and acceptable to go back. We'll talk about that. So the Columbia River, lifeblood of the Northwest, flows through Hanford for 50 miles, past 9 nuclear weapons production reactors, past literally hundreds of nuclear dump sites, contaminated soil with chemicals and radioactivity. And it's the last natural salmon spawning grounds on the river in the United States. It's vitally important to not only the ecology of the Northwest and our restoration of salmon, but it's vitally important, as we'll talk about, to recreation. It's the Hanford Reach National Monument, the only national monument that should be too contaminated for public use, but people are encouraged to go anyway. And as we're standing or sitting here today, contamination is seeping into that river at about 1,500 times the drinking water standard. Tick tock. There are 56 million gallons of high-level nuclear waste stored in very old tanks at Hanford. These tanks are the size of 4-story apartment buildings that cover an entire block. Million-gallon tanks. They were built so that when the US government took fuel out of those reactors, it melted the fuel rods down in nitric acid and other acids, creating a liquid stew, and went through a set of chemical processes and extracted tiny quantities of plutonium. First plutonium collected went to the first atomic bomb ever used at White Sands to test whether it would work. Scientists didn't know if it would create a chain reaction that would destroy the atmosphere. It didn't. And then the second bomb dropped on Japan. The Nagasaki bomb used plutonium also from Hanford. And from there we kept going, extracting more and more plutonium for tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. Those tanks are leaking. 67 of them were acknowledged by the Energy Department of the oldest single-shell tanks. They were just a carbon steel shell in the ground. 67 of them are admitted to have leaked well over 1 million gallons. Over 1 billion gallons was dumped straight into the soil when the US government ran out of room in the tanks in the 1950s and 60s. And in 2012, the Energy Department admitted that one of the newer double shell tanks, which weren't supposed to leak for decades more, had begun to leak. And just last week, the Energy Department and the state of Washington agreed that that leaking tank wouldn't even begin to be emptied for another 2 years. Federal and state laws say that you have to empty tanks that begin leaking as soon as practicable, if not immediately. But while that newer tank is going to be emptied in 2.5 years, we have some of the oldest single shell tanks that are leaking the most deadly brew ever concocted on the planet of liquid high-level nuclear waste and chemicals, leaking into the soil as we speak. And there is no schedule to empty those immediately whatsoever. And the Energy Department is refusing to put any money into emptying the leaking single shell tanks in the near future. Our state gave the Energy Department an agreement until the year 2040 to empty all the single shell tanks. My little quip on that is they'll be emptied by 2040, whether or not the Energy Department does anything. And the waste is spreading through the soil into the groundwater and will spread to the Columbia River, and it is spreading much more rapidly than the Energy Department said was possible just a few years ago. This is pictures of inside double shell tank AY102, which has been leaking for over 2 years. The Energy Department and the state of Washington, as I said, reached a settlement agreement a week ago to start emptying that tank 2.5 years from now. That is, to Citizen Watchdog, utterly unacceptable. If an oil company had a large above-ground tank with oil and it started leaking, federal government and the state government would apply that law immediately and say you must empty it immediately. But the Energy Department, which is largely self-regulating and fights us at every step of the way in terms of cleaning up Hanford, the Energy Department said, we're going to take several years before we get around to emptying this leaking tank. The state of Washington negotiated in secret and then simply announced, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start emptying it 2.5 years from now. Our view as watchdogs, citizen activists, is you don't get to make that secret deal and shake those hands without coming and talking to the public. We want public meetings. We want to know why we can't empty it faster. It's unacceptable to wait 2.5 years. The state's excuse is, well, we split the baby in half. The Energy Department in negotiations said they wanted 5 years. You don't split the baby in half when you're talking about nuclear safety. The danger from these tanks, this waste is not only radioactive, radiation creates heat. This is high heat in the tank. The waste flowing out from the bottom of the tank is blocking the cooling ventilation channels. In the 1950s, the US government had an explosion underneath one of these tanks when there was a leak and steam built up from the radiation releasing hydrogen gas and steam forming and blew up underneath one of the tanks. That's what we're afraid may happen here. You don't wait 2.5 years to deal with something like this. You do it right away. And the law says you do it right away. You don't make deals. And we have leaking single shell tanks. 1 to 6 of them are leaking as we speak. The Energy Department says only 1 is currently leaking. The other 5 that were probably leaking a couple of years ago seem to have stopped, they say. We don't think that they're right. Evidence seems to show that they continue to lose liquid. They have no plan to empty those tanks anytime soon. What about this? In 1973, it became illegal to dig a hole in the backyard and put your pizza boxes in it. It became illegal for municipal governments to have unlined landfills for your city garbage. Your United States government, in the name of making nuclear weapons, dumped radioactive waste in unlined ditches like this. In 2004, the citizen activists in the state of Washington, Heart of America Northwest, and other groups put on the state ballot an initiative to stop this practice and to prevent the Energy Department from using unlined ditches at Hanford as a radioactive waste dump for nuclear weapons production. 1 week after we aired our first advertisement showing photos like this, the Energy Department stopped dumping radioactive waste in unlined ditches at Hanford in 2004. Unfortunately, citizens in some other states haven't been as aggressive as we are, and your federal energy department at other nuclear weapons sites still dumps radioactive waste in unlined ditches. But it gets even better. The state of Washington operates a commercial radioactive waste dump in the center of Hanford in unlined ditches. What are we talking about for cleaning this up? 40 miles of trenches 50 feet deep. Picture Interstate 5 from downtown Seattle all the way through North Seattle, through Linwood, through Everett to Marysville. 3 lanes wide. Now picture it as a ditch 50 feet deep, 40 miles filled with radioactive waste like this. That's a cleanup challenge, and it needs to be cleaned up. But the Energy Department says we'd just like to cover it with dirt and leave it there. Let's bring it closer to home. The United States Navy used Sandpoint Naval Air Station, which is now Magnuson Park in northeast Seattle, up until the early 1990s. Turns out they left radioactive contamination in the ground and in the buildings where my children have grown up playing soccer and picking blackberries and going to summer camp, and where many other people, probably some of you in this room, use Magnuson Park. It's the #1 recreational park in all of Seattle for the entire greater Seattle, Lake Washington area. And it's got a contamination problem. And the United States Navy and Seattle Parks learned about it in 2010. And until we went public with it to King Television in May of 2013, the public wasn't told. There are over 400 people who reside in homeless transitional housing at Sandpoint. Let's think about who those people might be and why they weren't told that where their children are playing, where they're growing, they're encouraged to grow vegetables and some of their own produce for their own tables, Why weren't these people told that the area may be contaminated? We don't know where the housing is, whether or not it's contaminated, but because the Navy hasn't tested. But it's possible, and the records are not available showing where they disposed of the waste on the base. What you have at the top end is Lake Washington, and the area that's shaded, the building right near the top of the lake, where the lake shore is where Arena Sports is for indoor soccer. And to the left, there's a building that's now being used as a Waldorf high school. And another area that's shaded is right behind the Mountaineers building, all of which was publicly accessible and heavily used until May of 2013, when we forced the Navy to tell the public about it. The Navy told the public not to worry. The risks are acceptable. It's all safe, and it is, quote, low level, unquote. Their first public presentation that I went to the Magnuson Park Advisory Committee, the Navy's PR spokesperson held up a sheet of paper and said, alpha radiation is what is given off by radium, and it can be stopped by this sheet of paper. So if it's distributed under the soil somewhere, or it's inside some of the buildings, but no one goes in those areas of the buildings, it is perfectly safe. Turns out, well, you have to know a little bit about radiation, a little bit of physics, but radium doesn't just give off alpha radiation, it also gives off gamma radiation. Bo Jacobs talked about alpha radiation. That is plutonium particles, for instance. Radium, if it gets in your lungs, it stays and keeps ticking away, causing cancer. But gamma radiation penetrates through several feet of soil, through cement walls. And they told us it was safe. Johnson Atoll in the Pacific, U.S. territory, ironically administered by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where we tested bombs. There's a common theme here. The United States government has struck on this great public relations plan for contaminated areas, saying they're wildlife refuges and people should come and see them as such, and therefore it's safe. And over and over again, including the 50-mile stretch of the Columbia River that is contaminated, which was declared the Hanford Reach National Monument. This is a picture of a little accident at Johnson Atoll where a nuclear-tipped missile blew up on the launch pad in 1962, spreading plutonium and other radionuclides. And it's not the only accident that happened there. And this is from Wikipedia, as you can see. Speaks for itself. It's used as a missile base, a chemical weapon, an Agent Orange storage disposal site. And it's contaminated. We're going to talk about what they call safe for cleanup levels. And then Eniwetok, downwind from the first H-bomb test. What you have the picture here is the nuclear dump site, one of the craters used with a concrete dome over the top of it. What do you think happens with climate change and the ocean rising here? What do you think? In 1980, the US government declared it's safe for indigenous peoples to return. Let's go back to Hanford. What happens when tanks keep leaking? What you have on your left is a computer simulation of tanks that are leaking and showing the gamma radiation levels from different types of radionuclides moving down through the soil based on actual readings all the way to groundwater. The waste is moving through the soil to groundwater. The Energy Department just 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was saying it would take thousands of years for waste that leaked out of these tanks to move through the soil column to groundwater. It's there. And it only takes between 20 and 50 years for that groundwater to move contaminants to the Columbia River. And it's moving. There are over 80 square miles. This is a map of Hanford showing the groundwater plumes, contaminated groundwater plumes. You have the river running up along past the 9 nuclear reactors through the area here where they fabricated fuel, and then running past the city of Richland. The center part of Hanford was where they melted down the fuel rods and created the liquid high-level nuclear waste from which plutonium was extracted. This is the Energy Department's own projection of uranium-238 in the Hanford groundwater in the year 2135. The areas that are dark red are 50 times the drinking water standard. The drinking water standard in the United States is set at a level at which an adult male drinking a normal amount of water for an adult male every day, 1 out of every 10,000 die of cancer. That's the acceptable risk level in our drinking water standard for carcinogens. The dark red areas are the projections from the Energy Department of, under its cleanup plans, leaving behind waste from tanks that have already leaked, and some of the residue in the bottom of tanks, and the stuff in the burial grounds. This is their projection of 120 years from now, the uranium moving to the Columbia River. Unless you think that it stops and the risk goes away, this is their projection in the year 3890. It just keeps giving. It's the gift that doesn't stop. So as activists, we've been saying to the Energy Department and the state of Washington, we want public meetings about your agreements, and we want you to start emptying the leaking single shell tanks in the next year and not continue to let them leak. We want new double shell tanks to be built so that you have some place to store the waste. The Energy Department has a plant under construction to change the liquid high-level waste to a glass form called vitrification. The plant started construction in the year 2000. It was supposed to cost $4 billion and be ready by 2011. The price tag is now in the $13 billion range. It will not be ready to have any part of it operating by the year 2019. And this portion of the plant to deal with the highest radioactive wastes from those tanks has no timeline for being completed because of safety problems that the Energy Department ignored as it started building the plant. So who's at risk? Because it's not, turns out, the 55-year-old guy who goes out along the Columbia River and throws his fishing rod in, well, didn't throw the rod in, just throws the hook in and hangs out for a couple hours We have 3 Native American nations that signed the treaties of 1855, the Yakima, Umatilla, and Nez Perce tribes, in which they gave up the areas around Hanford and much of eastern Washington to the US government and the state of Washington, at that time Oregon Territory and Washington Territory, and signed a treaty guaranteeing them in perpetuity not only the right to half the fish, but the right to live along and fish the Columbia River. Their culture, their religion, depends upon access to salmon. And the last natural spawning ground that is undammed on the whole stretch of the Columbia River in the United States is the Hanford Reach. After World War II was over, the Army Corps of Engineers, which ran the Hanford project for the Manhattan Project, said, we can't let people back along the Columbia River because we have to keep making bombs. They had told the Native American tribes that they couldn't fish during World War II, moved out the white settlers and told the tribes that they'd be able to come back in 1946 when the war was over. Many tribal elders still recall how they or their parents actually hid their fishing canoes along the Hanford Reach of the Columbia River because they were told they'd be able to come back. In the 1950s, the US government, well, first in 46, the Army Corps issued a directive saying that all studies of contamination, including the risk from eating fish, would be kept classified and secret until we've solved the public relations problem. And that's what they called it in 1946. And in the mid-50s, they said, y'all come back. And they held a big celebration for the tribes and invited them back and told them it was safe to fish. Then, of course, they learned better. And now the Energy Department is saying, y'all come back again. It's safe. We're cleaning up to safe levels. And you can all come back and fish. And the risks are acceptable to whom? So they have the right to not only fish out of the river, but to erect structures and live, teach their children about the native plants, to build sweat lodges, and to use those native plants that are essential for the continuation of their religion and culture. So, if that's the treaty right, don't you think that we have a legal and moral obligation to ensure that it really is safe for Native Americans to live along and fish the Columbia River? Do we have a disparate impact if we say, well, it's safe for Gerry Pollet, who uses the Columbia River 2 hours a day, 2 days a week, 8 weeks a year? The cancer risk will be acceptable for me. But what about Native American with a family fishing the river and erecting structure and instructing the children in how to use a sweat lodge? Turns out that one of the highest exposures that people get to contaminants in water is not just from drinking the water, which is what you immediately think of. It's actually for carcinogens if you take a shower in the water, because the vapor droplets go into your lungs. In a sweat lodge, that is magnified many, many times over. And sweat lodges are essential to the religion and cultural life of the Yakimas and the Umatillas and Nez Perce. And they want to be able to continue that tradition. But the risks are astonishingly high if they eat the fish, live along the river, and how do they get water to drink, and where does the water come from for their sweat lodge? The water comes out of the ground, and the groundwater is going to remain contaminated. This summer, the Energy Department issued a proposed plan for cleanup of the F reactor area at Hanford. All the reactors were named by letters: B, C, D, F, K, N. One of the real ironies here is that in the 40s, they decided that they would confuse the Soviet Union by naming the area along the river that was where the reactors were. You didn't want to tell them this is the reactor area, so they called it the 100 area, and the inland area the 200 area. So you wouldn't say, I'm working in the reactor area. Didn't want to give away the secret to the Soviets. Of course, Soviets could figure out what was going on pretty quickly. So the F reactor area. Last spring, the Energy Department declared the soil for most of the area to be cleaned up and safe for anyone to use. And then for the last spots along the river and the groundwater, they said, here's our cleanup plan going forward. We're going to, and this is right out of their own document. There are 16 sites that contain cesium-137, cobalt-60, cesium, europium-152 and 154, nickel-63, and strontium-90 contamination at levels considered dangerous to human health. That's their document, their words. You'd think that would be called to clean it up. But the Energy Department instead has said, we're not cleaning it up. We're going to leave areas uncleaned up, and we're going to restrict public access. We're going to tell people that you don't use this area over here, but you can use the area over here. And for how long can you not use the area over here? 160 to 264 years. Who's going to be around to tell the tribes not to go over here, not to use the groundwater from over here? Is from some of our members and members of Columbia Riverkeeper at a protest at the public meeting this summer about this. You see how close this area is to the Columbia River. This is what it looks like today. And you're not going to put up barbed wire fences. The Energy Department's plan is to say, y'all come back. This is the Hanford Reach National Monument. We want you to use it. We tell you it's safe and Native Americans can use it. But, oh, this spot here and this spot here can't use for 150 to 264 years. Is that reasonable? This is how we look at exposure. These are the different areas that, from the high-level waste tanks on the left, from burial grounds, things flowing into the groundwater, to the person along the river, to the fish. What's not shown here is the plants that pull up the contamination from the groundwater and which are essential to the culture and religion of the tribes. Or to people simply like you and me who may decide to use the Hanford Reach National Monument, go fishing and pick berries along the shoreline. Whoops. Well, they're hot enough to make jam on their own. We're going to jump ahead about the role citizens have played here. We determine risk by looking at exposure scenarios. How will you be exposed to what is left in the ground or in a building in a contaminated area? Whether it's an Awetok Fukushima, Hanford. In July, I was asked to speak at a symposium at the UW Law School on global contamination issues, and they had a UCal professor of Japanese descent who is a nuclear physicist and done calculations about Fukushima. And his calculations were based on the Japanese government standards. Here is the level at which cesium-134 and 137 in the soil reach from the plume maps, and you saw from Bo Jacobs some plume maps of where the radiation landed. He said, well, based on this and decay, today you can invite people back into these areas, and the Japanese government is using this model. And it was impolite, but you don't challenge fellow panelists at a academic symposium. But I couldn't help. I said, what is the dose rate from that? And he said, I don't know the dose rate. I'm a physicist. I can tell you what the decay rate is. I can tell you what the radiation level is. Okay, so let's look at that. And we just sat there and calculated it. And the dose rate was a radiation level that the Japanese government is using to invite people to return to their communities. Just from one radionuclide would cause a fatal cancer risk in adults of over 5%. The children are 3 to 10 times more susceptible to die of cancer from the same exposure. That's because we look at exposure scenarios, and as you saw from him, children play outside, children play in the dirt, children eat dirt. The same dose goes into a little lung, it's different than in a big lung. The same radiation gets inhaled in an alpha particle for a lung that is growing. The cancer risk is much greater than a lung that is matured. Much less we start talking about neurological development and development of ovaries, development of testicles in youth, and you have much, much greater radiation cancer risks than you do for an adult male. The Energy Department says for areas along the Columbia River, we're going to clean up to allow for a use that is safe for an industrial worker inside a building 40 hours a week. That means you leave thousands of times more contamination in the soil. What happens if in that area you say, let's have a child care center for our children? Because I'd like to be able to have people bring their kids and drop them off at a child care center near where they work. And you've cleaned it up to a level that's only safe for someone 40 hours a week inside a building. The role of public health advocates is to say, let's look at all these cultural issues and involve the public in determining what uses of the resources they will have and putting together what is called the reasonable maximum exposure scenario. So for Magnuson Park, that reasonable maximum exposure scenario would be a child picking blackberries, growing food, and living at the park because we have 400 housing units in the park. The Navy is cleaning up that park to an exposure scenario that is based on someone like me using the park only 2 hours a day, 2 days a week. My own kid uses Magnuson Park for soccer practice and games 3 times a week for 2 hours a day. But he doesn't live in the park. Who lives in the park? Oh, it's poor people. It's people who don't look like me. And the Navy has forgotten about those people, and they have legal rights under the Civil Rights Act to not have a disparate impact on their health from government decisions. And they don't have a treaty, but they have other legal rights that we are ignoring. The Native American tribes at Hanford have a treaty that is the sovereign law of the nation. It can't be violated, theoretically. But their cancer risk from living along the Columbia River at the F reactor area includes a risk to their children that we calculate at well above 25% cancer risk rates. And that's when the US government says, it's clean, y'all come back. And that's because we look at it and work with them and say, what are the different exposure routes? And if you're living there for 6 months of the year, and you're using the groundwater, and you're picking what parts of a plant do you use? What about fish? Most standards, when we talk about fish, talk about a fillet from the fish. But many of our immigrant populations use the whole fish. Our Native Americans use the whole fish. And guess what? It turns out that the contaminants concentrate in areas of the fish that aren't sold at Safeway, but are used by our immigrants and our Native Americans. The head is used where contamination concentrates, for example. Governor Inslee, you may have read, seen this is in the news recently, agreed to meet the concerns of tribes and increase the fish consumption level used in cleanup standards in the state of Washington, which had been set at a level that is about this much fish was all a person ate every day. And in the legislature, we are going to have a battle royale over this because we have a lot of people saying, why should we set the fish consumption level for cleanup decisions based on what Native Americans or Vietnamese immigrants eating fish from the Duwamish do, instead of having a survey of what the average Washingtonian eats? That's the debate. And let me tie up here. These are exposure scenarios that were used for the different cleanup decisions. This is from an EPA training. And you see, second from the top, Eniwetok was used for saying someone living here is going to be safe, and not only using the surface, but the subsurface. And Johnson Atoll, not using the subsurface. No one digs, is their presumption for Johnson Atoll. What's really ironic here is, this sounds pretty good for Eniwetok. No one lives there beforehand. But imagine telling people who have returned, you're not ever going to get to dig. What about the plants that reach down and go more than 15 feet with their root system? And at Hanford, we have enough plutonium at Hanford left in the soil to build more than 70 nuclear bombs. And the Energy Department's proposed cleanup level for plutonium at Hanford, as you'll see in the next slide, was 2,900 picocuries per gram. Just remember 2,900, okay? And where citizens have been active and forced better cleanups to be protective, like at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, they're cleaning up the soil to only 2.5, so 1,000 times more protective than what was proposed for Hanford. And this is, again, look at Johnson Atoll here. US government cleaning up at 2.1 to 210 in the soil. And they're saying the cancer risk to the wildlife researcher is 1 in 10,000. So someone who lives there only occasionally and no children, because Johnson Atoll was not, there were no residents. Hanford, 2,900. After we organized, they announced a great compromise. Shouldn't we be pleased that they're cleaning up Hanford's soil to 760 versus 2.5. We're not pleased. Who's going to be exposed? People with treaty rights to live along and fish and use the resources. Okay, we're gonna skip ahead here and Magnuson Park. So what if this contamination was in your neighborhood? It is. And the Navy is saying, we're leaving contamination and telling you it's safe to use the park based on a cleanup level that is safe for use 2 hours a day, 2 days a week. And at that level, you'll get a radiation dose of 15 millirem. 15 millirem for adult males means 8 out of 10,000 die of cancer. Females, adult women, are 60% more susceptible to get cancer and die than a man. But the standard is based on male exposure. Children are 3 to 10 times more susceptible to get cancer. So who should we be protecting under a reasonable maximum exposure scenario? Is it me? Or is it a child who lives in the park and uses it year-round? There's a public meeting Tuesday, October 21st. Hope you will all come, or as many of you as can will come. There'll be an open house, tables, information tables at 6, the start of the meeting at 7. And we hope that you'll come and join us in pressing the City of Seattle, the Washington Department of Ecology, and the Navy to say 2 hours a day, 2 days a week is unacceptable. Year-round residents need to be protected. And 15 millirem of dose is unacceptable. Use a cancer risk level that we're supposed to use in our state law, which is we call acceptable risk by state ballot initiative. The public adopted a ballot initiative saying acceptable risk for Washington state contaminated sites is 1 additional cancer for every 100,000 people exposed. We had to do it by ballot initiative. It works for the cleanup of gas stations. It would work for the cleanup of Magnuson Park, but the Navy doesn't want to apply it, and the State Department of Ecology refuses to force them to. And this is just, how hot was it? I just want to close with this. The Navy, I told you, told everyone the contamination out there could be stopped by a piece of paper. It's low levels of radiation. In fact, outside of the building that houses Arena Sports in the soil, the Navy's own contractor found hotspots of radioactivity that are now being cleaned up, but they'll leave some behind, that were so hot that if you just sat on the ground year-round at that spot, just put your butt on the ground, you would get the equivalent of 1,200 X-rays in a year. That's what they called low level and safe. They knew it, but they insisted that it would be stopped by a piece of paper. This was the gamma radiation coming up through the soil from what they left behind. And now they say, we're cleaning it up, but we're going to leave behind levels that'll give you a 15 millirem radiation dose from just 2 hours a day, 2 days a week. And that doesn't count if someone ever uses the groundwater. It doesn't count the child who lives in the park, picks blackberries, grows vegetables, and puts the soil in their mouth. So our job is to be the advocates. And I want you to be an advocate. Use your education to go out and advocate for the communities, and instead of just studying them, you have an obligation to protect and advocate for communities, not just study them. That I'll shut up. Thank you, everyone. The question is, how did we force the Navy to make this information public? So one of the funny stories here is that the Navy knew about the contamination for 3 years along with Seattle Parks, including how hot the radioactivity levels were. And they decided that their public information officers would call local elected officials and tell them that the Navy is proudly beginning a little cleanup effort in your district. And I was one of their entire communication program consisted of calling 4 elected officials. And of course, as state representative for the area, I was one of them. And I was the only one who said, what contamination in Magnuson Park? What kind of contamination? What levels? It's that low-level stuff. It's just radium, and it can be stopped by a piece of paper. And we began demanding, Heart of America Northwest as a citizens group, and I as an elected official working with citizens group, began saying to the Navy, we want more. And the Navy wouldn't give us more information. And so we told the state, you've got to ask for more information. And the state kind of begrudgingly asked for more information. We learned a little bit more. And then we used the Freedom of Information Act to demand that the Navy turn over records. And that's how we got many of them. But the Navy is still fighting us in court over many of the records about where they disposed of waste, for instance. They've refused to make them public. Where they disposed of waste at Sand Point. So it's been a 1.5 year long battle to try to get full disclosure, and we're not there yet. Well, the Energy Department, their primary mission is making nuclear weapons, despite their name. And so they are stuck in the Cold War, and they fight us about access to information every day. And we only learned about the Green Run, which was the massive release of radiation, and the other airborne releases through the Freedom of Information Act. It wasn't a voluntary disclosure by the United States government. And the US government has spent far more money fighting the lawsuit filed by downwinders than seeking medical not compensation, medical treatment and monitoring. The US government has spent much more money fighting the lawsuit than it would have just providing medical coverage for the downwinders. Tells you something. Yeah. Okay. And there is also, just as a follow-up on Magnuson Park, Chrissy, raise your hand, Chrissy, is organizer with Heart of America Northwest. Many of you met already. Just reminded me that there is a petition on change.org that really encourage you to sign and ask other people to sign about Magnuson Park cleanup, asking for an advisory committee so that we can have more access to public information and have regular forums. So please take a look at the petition on change.org for Magnuson Park. Thank you, everyone.